Training.com, CWI prep course. Come visit us at our website at train-eng.com, pronounced training. This is our CWI prep course. This is as you go through some of these videos, these will be some snippets or samples out of our online training course. If you like what you see here in the sample section, come and visit us and take the course. Unlike a lot of other programs, we've got it set up so that you can do it a la carte. If you only need we've got different parts of the CWI course broken out. So if you don't need to sit through and take safe practices for welding inspectors, or you have some strengths that you know of and you want to streamline the process and only hit the sections where you don't really have a strong background or a great deal of proficiency, our program is set up so you can take some of these parts of the CWI online course a la carte. Pick and choose, put together what you want. Leave the rest, like a Chinese food buffet. CWI prep course, Welding Defects, Module 9, Part 1. Learning objectives. In this module, we're going to touch base on definitions, fusion weld discontinuities, weld defects, definition of defects, and list of defects.
Introduction. Before a meaningful discussion can be held about welding defects, it is necessary to first establish definitions of terms that are particularly significant to the subject. Two terms continually emerge in relation to welding defects. One, discontinuity, and two, defect. These two words and their meanings and relationships are often confused and misunderstood. For the purpose of this course, the two terms are defined and explained as follows. Discontinuity is defined as an interruption in the normal physical structure of a weld. Defect, when any discontinuity is of such magnitude that it may impair the normal function of the weldment. It is then considered a defect. So, all defects are discontinuities, but not all discontinuities are defects. A discontinuity is an interruption in the normal physical structure of a weld. It's an interruption. It's an anomaly. It's not the same as everything else. Doesn't automatically flag it as a defect, but it could be. But all defects are an interruption in the normal physical structure of the weld and are discontinuities. Kind of that old thing. All Chevys are cars, but not all cars are Chevys. And in this case, you need to look at the codes, the specification, and your inspection criteria to see if the discontinuity is a defect. So that's the driving force. What documentation are you working to? Is it a defect or is it a discontinuity? You need to look at the rule book and see what game you're playing. You know, something that's a foul in hockey might not be a foul in other sports, or vice versa. I guess that wasn't a very good analogy, but you know, you can whack somebody pretty hard in hockey. It's not a foul necessarily. You do the same thing in tennis, it's probably going to be a foul. Same thing. You got to know which rule book you're working to, and that's what the welding codes are. You need to understand what, sport you're playing and what the rules are. I know this seems a little redundant, but we're going to hit this one just one more little time here. Discontinuity and defect, what are the difference? Like we said, a discontinuity is defined as an interruption in the normal physical structure of the weld. A defect is when the discontinuity is of such magnitude that it may impair the normal function of the weldment. It is considered a defect. I beating this into you guys' heads just because it's such an important thing, and it will come up over and over and over again during the course of your career. Fusion weld discontinuities. Fusion weld discontinuities are interruptions of the typical structure of a weldment, such as a lack of homogeneity in the mechanical, metallurgical, or physical characteristics of the material or weldment. Discontinuities which exceed recognized acceptance standards are termed defects, a word which signifies rejectability. Fusion weld discontinuities may be classified into three major groups, namely process and procedure related, metallurgical and design related, and some discontinuities are related to specific welding processes, while others are related to particular base or filler metals. Discontinuities may be found in the weld metal, the heat affected zone, and the base metal. Weld defects. Weld defects, like the welds themselves, must be described in standard terms. Common weld defects that you should be familiar with include incomplete fusion, inadequate joint and root penetration, spatter, overlap, undercut, root cracks, toe cracks, crater cracks, underbead cracks, voids, and inclusions. Wow, that's a pretty big list, and that's an awful lot of things that can go wrong in welding, which keeps weld inspectors employed. I guess if there was no defects, there would be no weld inspectors. But you need to, if you're going to be a weld inspector, you definitely have to have a very good grasp of the definitions of weld defects. It's pretty much the crux to the whole profession, is being able to identify them and, you know, line people out on how to fix them or directions they might go in, how to fix them. But definitions of weld defects, you definitely need to know. Definition of defect. The definition of defect must be considered in the context of the service conditions to be imposed on the weldment. If the service conditions are not severe, then most discontinuities can be of considerable magnitude and number without jeopardizing the integrity of the weldment. But if the service conditions are severe, then obviously most discontinuities must be considered as defects. So what's this mean? What's this telling us? Well, this is telling us, once again, it gets back to my, I guess, failed sports analogy. But defects, when you're judging a defect, you got to know which sport you're playing. If you're, what might be a defect on, you know, ASME B31.3 might not be a defect in D1.6. You know, it's not necessarily a defect. It's a discontinuity, but the code is going to tell you what a defect is. A bridge, something that might be a defect on a bridge, a weld on a bridge, might not be a defect on a HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. You might have two totally different acceptance criteria. The acceptance criteria is going to set the boundaries of what's a defect and what is not a defect. You know, stringent things like aerospace and nuclear power, things there that are defects and you might reject due to their acceptance criteria. You go to another service condition, rebar, you know, welding rebar, D1.4. It might not be a defect in that situation because you're sticking rebar together and putting it, you know, under concrete. So you need to understand definition of defect as it pertains to the code standard and customer requirements, as well as the acceptance criteria in which you're working to. Here's a list of weld defects. Kind of went through them before, but we'll hit them again. Doesn't hurt because this is pretty much the crux to the whole weld inspection thing. These are your defects that you're going to be looking at for the course of your career. Arc strikes, inadequate joint penetration, incomplete fusion, porosity, slag inclusions, undercut, cracks, spatter, root concavity, excessive reinforcement, drop through, overlap or cold lap, appearance, and distortion.
Summary. In this module, we covered the definitions, fusion weld discontinuities, weld defects, definitions of a defect, and the list of weld defects. Our CWI, CWE online Part A video course, $149. It's self-study CWI exam. Everything's an online video course. We've got one section where it's questions, questions, and more questions. We've got a whole number of CWI self-study question bank, $40. Come on in, take it, take a look, see. If you just need questions, if you sat through another course and you just want to keep hitting the material, check out our question bank, $40.